Well, thank you very much. Lo siento mucho, yo no puedo hablar en español contigo porque hoy mi español es terrible, pero gracias por la invitación. And I know that I am between you and the European Soccer Championship, so I'll be brief, okay? Just in terms of this question of the United Nations and making it more democratic. Democracy derives in the heart of people, as its Latin and Greek roots indicate. Without the power of people to move forward an agenda, you will never have the democracy from the state actors that represent you. The states are only as good as the people they ascend into leadership. So on a tactical and strategic level, if we want more democratization at the United Nations, more voices, that means civil society, from the grassroots up, the people I'm looking at in this room, ambassadors for the Embassy of Peace, the answer is in you. I'm looking at hundreds of millions of dollars going towards stopping genocide. It's in your hands. That power is truly yours. I've lived it in the United States, a place where it's very difficult to move forward issues. And we've done it in areas that the United States has never cared about. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a case study in stopping genocide, as is germane to the topic that we have today. So how do you get resources? How do you get a voice? Again, the UN is only as good as its member states. And people in this room, ambassadors for the Embassy of Activists for Peace, we rely upon you in your nations to rise as heads of state. Because if you believe that your voices must be heard, then you must make the movement to rise and be a transparent leader, a leader for democracy, for human rights, against genocide, against persecution. And so, with respect to, of course, the veto powers, you know, I've always, for the last 23 years at least, been wondering what good are our international laws if we fail to act. In the case of Sudan, where it was one of the bloodiest civil wars in the 20th century, 2 million people died there when I started working on the issue of the Sudanese conflict in the late 90s and early 2000s, more than in Rwanda, Bosnia, Somalia, Haiti, Burundi, conflicts combined. And it was a place for many Americans they knew very, very little about. They didn't know, Americans don't know much about the world as it is, and particularly not what happens in Africa. Not only that, America tends to look after its strategic national interests, as any country would, and by and large, Africa is put at the bottom of the list. Through the process of tackling an issue and connecting with an issue that Americans cared about, which was our own battle over slavery, the fact that in Sudan, not only did you have murder and slaughter of millions of people, but you also had slavery, chattel slavery, the kind that my ancestors went through, where people are bought and sold as property of another. And it shocked Americans that there was still people being handed down as property. And so we were able to connect. We were able to meet people where they are. And sometimes that's required. If we are to democratize the United Nations, having an understanding of the inequities and the things that are going wrong must become more transparent. We need television stations in nations across the world to broadcast the proceedings, the UN General Assembly meetings in greater detail so that people can be shocked by inaction or not. The media transparency, the issues that get the media images are the ones that get the attention, that get the money, that get the things that we want. It's a very important thing, but it's become even harder. It's our challenge because media is now so diffused across many channels, across the internet, across so many forums. People have less focus in major networks, and now they can get their news where they want it, how they want it. But it is important that civic society be strengthened, that leaders from groups like the Embassy for Peace rise, that media broadcasts help to democratize, and if we do that, what I'm talking about is less theoretical, it's more strategic, it's more tactical, but I've seen it work. We took that issue of genocide in Sudan, we connected with our audience, the American people. It was a vigorous campaign. We were on the road 2 weeks out of every month, at least, multiple of us, traveling the United States, building activists, much like what you're doing here through the Embassy for Activists for Peace. In the early 90s, we pioneered email activism, new technologies. It shocked Congress people in our country how many thousands of letters and emails that we were able to send with 2 clicks of a button. They'd never felt that kind of pressure before. They'd seen marches, they'd had visits, but when 50,000 people at the push of a button can send a letter to their congressperson and they're from that district that that congressperson is from, it has an impact. And so in terms of democratization and the powers deriving from people, we also have to remember that you have to have a multifaceted approach. Not only do you have to have action at the United Nations, but you have to have actions in your countries at home to back that up. Things like funding the International Criminal Court. We were able to pass a Sudan Peace Act. In addition to, we passed the first resolution in U.S. history which declared genocide in a conflict. So we declared genocide, which meant that we were, by international law, required to act, but then we backed it up with the Sudan Peace Act, which brought the actors of northern Sudan, the Arab Islamic fundamentalist government, and the blacks in the south, who were Christians and animists, who were being slaughtered in large numbers. We got them to a cessation. We got U.S. Diplomatic negotiations underway, and we put $300 million, which is unheard of for the United States to give $300 million to one single country. So I think that is an example of how international law and domestic law can work together to advance the Reformation. And so if we want a greater seat at the table at the United Nations, we have to look at how can domestic law support that? How can domestic law support international action? How can it demonstrate leadership? How can it demand a space at the table? So those are the things that I think will build it. It's a long-term play. It's a generational play. But if you look at those case studies, we will see that even though there's still conflict, there's not perfection. In one of the newest countries, South Sudan or Darfur, there's still conflict. And we acted 2 million deaths too late. But there is action where there was none, and I believe that that confluence is what is required of the global Embassy of Peace to move forward greater voice against genocide going forward. So thank you very much for inviting me.